You don't have a photo ID, and I have information that I shared in Ways and Means the other day, and I think all of us received a packet from the League of Women Voters, and they point out that 18% of the voters over 65 do not have a photo ID. And then if you're between 18 and 29, roughly 20% of that population group doesn't have a photo ID. But I focused on a little story the other night involving my mother, who took very serious her right to vote. And I don't think that, to the best of my knowledge, she ever missed an election. But if this law would have been in place and she hadn't been already voting and needed to get a photo ID, I want to explain what my mother's circumstances were. Her family came from Austin, Minnesota. They settled in Austin, Minnesota in the 1850s. I remember in the 1940s a picture in the Austin paper, front page story about my great-grandfather, who was at that point about 90 years old, and showing 5 generations. So this is a family that goes back with Minnesota citizenship back to the 1850s. Well, my mother happened to be a home birth, attended by a doctor in Austin, Minnesota. And many decades later, the doctor is deceased, no longer a doctor's office there, and her birth certificate had never been filed, or the registration of her birth. Well, at that point, my mother was prepared to take a trip to Europe, and she needed a passport. My point is, in talking about the passport, how complicated it can be to get a birth certificate. One of the things you can do is check the local newspaper to see, by the way, you need 3 proofs then if there isn't a birth on file. And one of the things that you could use, part of the 3 is the newspaper, and so my mother did a little research there and found that the Austin newspaper on the day she was born only said that a baby girl was born in Austin, Minnesota. No name, no address. So that wasn't anything she could use. But she could file an affidavit, and fortunately she had 2 brothers that were still alive, an affidavit that someone who knew of your birth, and they were able to witness that, her 2 older brothers, that they remembered the day that my mother was born. So that satisfied one of the criteria. She was able to use school records. So that took some additional effort to get her school records to show that she'd been enrolled in school when she entered kindergarten or 1st grade, whatever they did at the time of my mother's entering school, because we're turning the clock back many years. And the other thing that you could use, and at that point in time it was not easy to access, was the census records. And so she was able to show that she appeared on the census records in 1920. That she was born in Minnesota and was a part of those census records. So she was able to do that and get her passport. But I asked, going back to the League of Women Voters point here, 18% of our senior citizens don't have a photo ID. And how many of them would be willing to or able to go through all the hoops that my mother went through to get her passport for her trip to Europe? And you know what it took? By the time all those records were acquired, 2 years. By golly, the election would have been long gone, wouldn't it, if you were in that situation? So there are, in my view, huge problems with this. It will eliminate the ability of many people to exercise, Mr. Speaker, their right to vote. And I think that that's the important thing there, that we have to always remember that that is a basic right in the United States of America, and that is the right to vote, and it's an important part of our democracy. And what we should be doing is looking at ways of encouraging more voter participation rather than reducing the number of people that will be able to show up at the polls on Election Day. Thank you.